Hello and good evening from Berlin, everyone. I am truly delighted to welcome all of you to this session of the Paris Peace Forum. My name is Nora Müller. I head the International Affairs Department of the Kerber Foundation in Berlin. And as a proud co-founding member of the Paris Peace Forum, I am delighted to moderate this session on UN75 and the future of multilateralism. Time is really of the essence tonight, so let's get started right away. Admittedly, the UN has come a long way since it was founded in 1945, and for all intents and purposes, so have its challenges. But in January this year, the UN launched a truly impressive global dialogue initiative on the occasion of its 75th anniversary. All over the world, citizens were invited to share their vision, their hopes, and also their fears for the future, possibly for the next 75 years. And in addition to that, the Pew Research Center in Washington conducted a representative survey in 14 countries about public attitudes on the future of survey and of the consultation process were presented at this year's UN General Assembly in September. And like so many things in this very special year, it was a very special General Assembly because for the first time, it was held completely digitally. Now, against this backdrop, I am very, very happy to be joined by two speakers who really know what they're talking about. Please join me in welcoming, first of all, Fabrizio Hochschild, who is the special advisor to the UN Secretary General on this very specific anniversary for the UN. Fabrizio, great to have you with us. And joining us from Washington, D.C. today is Jeb Bell. Jeb is the Vice President for Global Strategy at the Pew Research Center. Jeb, fantastic to also tune in from the United States. Now, what we'll do in the next 45 minutes is, first of all, Fabrizio and Jeb will tell us about the process, about the UN at 75, and also about the results of the survey. And as always at the Paris Peace Forum, this is also about interaction with our audience, with the public. Even though we can't actually see you, we know that you're there, we know that you're out there. And you have the chance to ask questions, and I'll be happy to read out your questions, and please submit them through the live chat. Now, a virtual hop, skip, and jump from Berlin to New York. Over to you, Fabrizio. Please give us an idea of what the idea was behind this really massive consultation process called UN at 75.
Ja, thank you. Danke, liebe Nora. Wir sind auch der Kerber Stiftung sehr dankbar für die Zusammenarbeit. C'est un grand plaisir d'être chez vous cet après-midi, au moins virtuellement, pour vous présenter les résultats de notre anniversaire, de notre initiative pour le 75e anniversaire de notre institution. This year, the United Nations turned 75. It would be an understatement to describe this year as challenging or unprecedented. Our daily lives, the fact that we're meeting virtually instead of at the Grand Dalle, the fact that the UN headquarters remains at about 20% of capacity, serve as constant reminders of that. But it's precisely because of the challenges we face, and indeed the challenges we faced prior to the pandemic, from the climate crisis to deepening inequalities, that this anniversary and this discussion are so important. 75 years ago, the creation of the United Nations in the midst of the most destructive war ever was a testament to a courageous vision of world leaders then, in demonstrating concern for future generations and recognizing that cooperation and compromise was the best route to securing the welfare of those who came after them. That recognition is even more relevant today, as we are ever more interconnected and interdependent. And yet we see, in the words of the UN Secretary General, a surplus of multilateral challenges and a deficit of multilateral solutions. This is due in part to geopolitical tensions, but also a growing sense that multilateralism has not delivered adequately, or is not delivering on many of the biggest challenges we face, from climate emergency to long-standing conflicts. It's against this backdrop that the UN Secretary General, as you indicated, Laura, launched the UN75 initiative. He wanted us to undertake a global listening tour to seek fresh guidance, new inspiration from we the peoples to help us overcome the impasse in which we now find ourselves. We focused on seeking responses to 4 questions from people across the world. What are your priorities for post-COVID recovery? What are your priorities for the world 25 years from now? What do you see as the biggest threats to that vision? What are your expectations of international cooperation and the UN in particular to address any gap between hopes and fears? We have had feedback from more than 1,000 dialogues in person and online in 80 countries. We've gathered over 1.3 million responses in all 193 member and observer states through our short survey. And we reached out to universities and think tanks to also gather their inputs. And we worked with 2 renowned companies to undertake independent, scientifically sampled representative surveys in 50 countries, as well as media and social media analysis in 70 countries around the same questions. This was a crucial part of our initiative, as we wanted representative data to serve as a reality check to our own outreach efforts. The results were released on the 21st of September to coincide with the UN General Assembly's official high-level commemoration of the 75th anniversary, and I'm delighted that Jeb from Pew is here to take you through them in more detail for our discussion.
Thanks very much, Fabrizio. Jeb, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Fabrizio, and thank you, Nora. It's just wonderful to be here, part of this panel conversation. I just want to extend my additional gratitude to Fabrizio and his team at the United Nations for inviting the Pew Research Center to be part of UN75 initiative. As Fabrizio said, what's distinctive about the initiative is the focus on listening to citizens. And that is core to the mission of the Pew Research Center. For those of you not familiar with us, we are nonpartisan, but more importantly, we're non-advocacy. We really are not taking positions on policy. We're focused on the highest quality research possible, in particular focused on listening and capturing the voices of citizens around the globe. So it's an honor to be part of the initiative. And it's an extreme pleasure to be part of this particular event because, as Fabrizio said, this is all about, and as you too highlighted, Nora, UN75 initiative is about a global dialogue. And this event is an expression and a continuation of that spirit and commitment to dialogue. So really appreciate the opportunity to share some high-level findings. These are very much highlights. Fabrizio gave you a sense for just really the richness of the data collected from multiple data streams. So today I will be highlighting some of the findings using illustrations mainly from the 14 countries that we surveyed at the Pew Research Center They're major donor countries, so these publics do matter in terms of their opinion. They can influence the future of international cooperation. But let me be clear, between all the data streams, we also heard from many citizens in the global south and emerging and developing countries too. And I can allude to some of those findings. And certainly I think those are worth conversation as much as the 14 countries I'll focus on today. So let me just begin by making sure that I tell you what I think the main 4 takeaways are. As I go through these slides, you may see data, you may get caught up in any one of the particular slides. So let me just highlight for everyone what I think are 4 big takeaways from what we've been able to find out in our research this year with UN75 initiative. One is that public support has survived the COVID-19 pandemic for international cooperation. Public support for international cooperation remains strong and evident in our 14 countries and also in the global south. The second, the UN is respected for its core mission. If there is a question about the UN and its role in the future, it is, can the UN produce results? There are mixed views on that. Third, there is a clear sense among many of the citizens we surveyed, that Edelman surveyed in the Global South, of the people we heard from through the dialogues and the online UN survey, there's a clear sense of some of the most pressing priorities for the near and long term. And I'll focus mainly on the long term today, and climate change stands out. And finally, if there's an additional consideration or challenge for international cooperation and achieving the future that people expect or want, as Fabrizio indicated, it is, can the United Nations, can multilateralism writ large take into account the interests of average citizens? So those are 4 big takeaways that I hope stay with people and lead to questions and a discussion after the slides. So let me show you some of the findings in greater detail, if I can. I will ask to somehow make this happen. Here I go. All right. So to my point earlier about one of the key findings is that international cooperation has survived the pandemic. It's just a point that I want to stress, that when we look at the 14 countries we studied at Pew Research Center, it is a majority, roughly 6 in 10, who say that if their country had cooperated more with other countries, their own country would have been able to have less of the tragic impact of the pandemic. So that the lesson being taken away by most people is that we needed more international cooperation rather than less to handle the pandemic. So I don't think that was a given. I would tell you then that everyone agrees. There are differing views on this, but the majority or prevailing view across the surveys we looked at and in the other countries looked at in the Global South is an embrace of international cooperation and its value, even in this year of the pandemic. To give a finer point on that, when we look at the 14 major UN donor countries that we looked at, 6 in 10 say the WHO did a good job dealing with the coronavirus. So the performance is seen as positive by the WHO. And again, the idea that more international cooperation would have actually helped reduce the impact of COVID-19. These are, I think, really important findings and significant success stories when we think about the value of international cooperation in the public's view. Now, as I mentioned earlier, one of the other key takeaways is that the UN is respected for its core mission, and I'll give you some specific findings in just a moment. That is coupled with the perception that it's not always successful in delivering results on specific issues. So broadly speaking, when we talk about the UN being respected for its mission, what do we see in these 14 major UN donor countries is that the UN is getting really high marks for at least 2 major elements of its mission, which is protecting human rights and promoting peace and stability in the world. These are really strong percentages by polling standards. So this is a very clear perception of the UN doing this. We ask, what does the UN do? Not just what is its mission, but what does it do? The UN does these things in the eyes of the people we surveyed. In the Global South, one of the key findings is that besides asking, what the UN does, what matters is the UN really engaged in practical change, education, health, material well-being, and it's seen as being needed in those areas. So, clear message, UN is valued for its mission. But again, it's not always the case that the UN is seen as delivering results. And there are challenges that people see, that citizens see in front of us. Some of those are near term. So in the Global South, in this year, the COVID-19 pandemic, it's clearly the case that health is on the minds of many people, as well as economic well-being, as well as education, some really practical, immediate challenges. But when we ask both in the Global South and the Global North about the longer term, the big challenges in front of us, it's interesting to note and important to realize that even in this year of COVID-19, the importance of climate change has not dissipated. It remains very pronounced. To give you a clearer sense for that, in our 14-country survey, it's roughly the same percentage in this year of COVID-19 that say climate change is a major global threat as say that in the spread of infectious disease, of which COVID-19 is a prime example, is a major threat. I will say that as a pollster, I was surprised to see this result. I was anticipating that COVID-19 would override every other concern, especially in the longer term. And it's certainly the case that COVID-19 infectious disease is on people's minds. There's no doubt. It's all around us. But climate change remains just as important as we've seen it be in the past. So I think this is a really key finding. When people think long term and the most important issues facing the world, climate change remains prominent. And then my final major point that I wanted to share is the perception that the United Nations isn't always effective in connecting with citizens, not always aware of what their needs are, or understanding those needs. And as we think about challenges in front of us, and we think about the nature of the UN75 initiative, the initiative was as much about how we tackle challenges as what those challenges are. And so in our survey, we asked about the how. And this is one of the major challenges for the UN, how to connect with citizens. And it was the purpose of UN75 initiative. So it's not that Fabrizio and his colleagues don't understand the importance of this, but our own survey tells us there's work to be done here. The one thing I will underscore is it's not necessarily unique to the United Nations. And I've said this to multiple audiences about our findings. We've seen similar reactions to institutions like the European Union, another multilateral organization, different scale, different focus. But it too gets credit for its mission, but is often criticized for not connecting with citizens. So it may be that multilateral organizations face a common challenge in this regard. So that's kind of not great to hear. And you can see the result here. Across the 14 countries, just 53%. It's a very mixed view on the UN caring about ordinary citizens. So that's not a great way to finish. So let me give you a little more hopeful finding, and that is to highlight the importance of young people. And we see this consistently in our surveys in the 14 countries that we covered, and it also comes out of the research in the Global South. The young people are more open, more embracive of international cooperation, more supportive of the United Nations. To put a finer point on it, my slide's a little small, but consistently, the young adults in our surveys, 18 to 29-year-olds, are more positive about the UN, more convinced that international cooperation would have made a difference, and more willing to see their country compromise with other countries when it comes to dealing with international problems. So while there are challenges in terms of the issues we face, challenges in how we can go about facing those challenges together, we do see evidence that there is at least an age difference, if not a generational difference, in our findings, and that could be a resource as the United Nations, its partners, and we all move forward to a better future, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a truly fascinating presentation. And we already have some questions from the audience coming in. But before we take them, let me kick this off with a follow-on question to you, Jeb. In fact, I think the one thing that stood out from your presentation is really that not only the UN, also other international organizations have to get better at connecting with the people and making their work actually matter to the lives of ordinary people. Is there anything in the data that you collected, in the data you surveyed, that could point the UN in a certain direction? Any piece of advice that you have for Fabrizio and his colleagues?
Yes, I think that, across the multiple data streams, and not just our own surveys, it is this listening. The act of listening counts. In addition to listening, we see across the data streams a request, if not in some cases more of a demand, for greater transparency and inclusivity. And I think those are key concepts, key desires in terms of how we go about facing common global challenges that come through pretty loudly and clearly. And again, I think the UN75 initiative has already anticipated that, but what we're hearing is there's work to be done on that front.
Mm-hmm. That sounds good. Work to be done, Fabrizio. Let me throw this ball into your court and ask you, you've done this very impressive consultation work, and the big question is, and now what? You heard from Jim that people want a more transparent, a more inclusive UN. What are you doing with the findings now?
Well, there are two major work streams that we're pursuing to try and turn these findings into concrete actions that will address some of the shortcomings that Jeb so eloquently articulated. First, we're diffusing our material, our findings, as widely and broadly as possible within the UN system, both among staff, but also among member states and among key stakeholder allies, so that our findings can become material for advocacy and ammunition for change. Secondly, in parallel, the member states themselves negotiated a UN75 declaration that was adopted by all heads of state, on the 21st of September. And that declaration, which our findings fed into, calls upon the Secretary General to come back to member states with very concrete proposals about how some of these shortcomings can be better addressed. And one of the main focus, I know, of the Secretary General's proposal, because this is very close to his heart, is this issue of how to make the UN much more inclusive, much more reflective of the diverse stakeholders in the world's reality today, and not so much a historic artifact of the power that were 50, 60, 70 years ago. So there will be, on the one hand, we're trying to push for change through putting our findings out there. And on the other hand, the Secretary General will be coming back with very concrete proposals. And since they've been requested by member states, they will be considered by member states and hopefully lead to very concrete action. And I think there is a broad awareness of the need for what in the resolution is called an upgrade, but a renewal, a reinvigoration of international cooperation and a modernization of it.
Right. And maybe to press you a bit further, Fabrizio, fast forward to 2045, right? So what will your ideal UN look like in 2045? What will be the two major, or let's say the three major features of the UN systems that should have been changed by then?
Well, I think for one, it will better reflect the diversity of our world today. So it will be more inclusive of youth voices. It will be more inclusive of countries from the global south. It will better reflect concerns and bring in concerns of the business community and of civil society actors. So a more diverse and more inclusive UN with working methods that facilitate that. Second, I think greater concentration on managing global public goods. And I think we've become ever more aware of what those are in recent years. Global health is obviously the one that's at the forefront of headlines today, but the environment, species diversity, biodiversity, climate is another. Growing gaps between rich and poor is a third. So growing sharper focus on the management of global public goods with very clear, achievable targets. And thirdly, and this is something that I think somewhere we lost along the line. If you look to the origins of the UN, And the conceptualization of the UN happened at the height of the World War II in Washington in December 1941 by the 4 Allied leaders. And at the height of a war, far worse than the current crisis that we're living today, they had the foresight, they had the vision, the courage to think up of an institution to safeguard succeeding generations. That's the formulation used in the Charter. But here you had people who came together in the midst of a war which was far from one, thinking, what can we do to save generations after us from the perils that we've lived through twice in our lifetimes? And I think that focus on the world we're going to leave behind, as opposed to our profit margins in the next quarter, or where we're going to spend our holidays in a few months from now, that focus on the welfare of those who come after us, I think that obligation towards future generations has to be reinfused in our actions and our thinking at the UN. And I think that was definitely there at the outset, but seems to have got lost a little bit along the way.
Right. Thanks very much, Fabrizio. Jeb, I'll come to you in a moment with a question about the next generation and about what young people think about the UN system. But Fabrizio, here's a nice question from our audience, in fact, that relates nicely to what you said about the UN having to become more reflective of the balance of power in the 21st century, basically. So here it is. Is there a citizen interest in reform at the UN, especially the Security Council, to be more reflective, to be more effective and reflect the modern world in composition? So it's all about the Security Council. What's your take, Fabrizio?
I think the potential, and this is a widely shared view in New York, unfortunately, that the potential for significant change of the Security Council is limited. I mean, there have been debates of this for decades, and sadly they haven't advanced. But I think it would be unfortunate to focus all our desire for change, all our measurement of how successful change is on what's achievable with the Security Council. I think there are many, many other ways of upgrading and modernizing the UN that will be more successful and more impactful than making our ambitions contingent on what can or cannot be done in the Security Council.
Although that's kind of the crown jewel, right? The UN Security Council is it's kind of the crown jewel, right? The Security Council.
Yeah, I mean, in days previous to COVID, at the beginning of this year, I visited 12 different countries on 4 different continents. I spoke to university students in every one of them. And the young people were inevitably, but there's this mixture, and I think Jeb brought it out very well, of very high aspirations for the UN, a great desire to see it work well, a strong recognition of its importance, and at the same time, a sense that it's not quite delivering on what people want, and it's rather remote. But then when you drill down on that and you ask, well, what is the source of your criticism? Inevitably, the first thing you'll hear about is the failures of the Security Council to agree on fundamental issues. I mean, the fact that the Syria conflict has gone on for almost 9 years, we've had hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, and it's unable to agree on a political way forward. The fact that it took them 6 months to have a rather weak statement supporting the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. I mean, inevitably, that casts a negative light on all, but there's no sign. I mean, that's very much linked to resurgence of superpower rivalry, and I'm afraid the form it takes may vary now, but we'd be I think it'd be a little bit overly optimistic to think that that's going to go away anywhere soon. But that doesn't mean that we can't advance in other areas, and there are plenty of other areas where one can advance and where we are advancing. The UN today, and it's one of the few institutions that can boast that, has, for the first time ever under this Secretary General, a larger number of senior women on its staff in the top positions than it does men. So there we've achieved equity. There are many other areas where we have to become more inclusive, but we are advancing where we can.
Jeb, I thought really that the good news in terms of the outcomes of your survey was that so many young people believe that they believe in the UN system, they believe in multilateral cooperation, and I was kind of wondering whether this could be a springboard for innovation within the UN also. Is there anything in the survey that you found that could sort of guide us in this direction? Do you think young people have concrete wishes when it comes to reforming the UN system? What is it they expect from the UN?
Yeah, so in terms of young people and what they want, what they expect, in terms of the issues we looked at, in terms of global threats, there aren't really significant differences. For example, in climate change, that cuts across generations. It's really this question of the potential for how we approach the challenges, where I think the younger generation, if I can call them that, may be different in their mindset, and they may be different, as Fabrizio was indicating, and their openness to new ways of engaging and new ways of approaching these major issues. I would note that one of the things that I would like to better understand across countries is whether it's part of a life cycle. I think there might be elements that are when you're young, you're more open, you're more willing to try things. But I do know that we've looked more closely at it in a country like the United States, and we are seeing indications that there is a generational component, meaning that what might be at play here is something that when we talk about a future in 2045, the people who may be part of leading to that future are going to be potentially different in their worldviews. And that's really intriguing and something I hope we can develop more in terms of understanding what is that worldview, how resonant it is with people who are younger, and whether there is some coherence to that desire to approach things differently.
But there are no indications in the survey as it is in terms of that change in attitudes. What could that actually mean?
I don't see, in terms of substantive issues, to try to answer your question directly, a clear indication that there's something different about the agenda for the younger people in our surveys. I would again stress that in a series of online surveys that the UN conducted as part of this, in the dialogues, especially this demand for the inclusivity and transparency, I think that we would be well served if we kept that in mind as something that may very well matter more. I want to say for certain, but I think it may very well matter more for younger people.
And that leads us nicely to another question from our viewers. How can governments and NGOs collaborate to integrate youth and women into multilateral diplomacy? Now, Jim, seeing as you also were a diplomat in your previous life, do you have any thoughts about that? What kind of a role could both governments and NGOs play when it comes to more integrative approaches?
Well, I'm not often asked to talk about my life as a diplomat. What I would offer is that I was involved in my previous career with the U.S. State Department in public diplomacy. And I think it requires the kinds of efforts that you see Fabrizio and his team engaging in, where you're intentional. You're intentional in who you're reaching out to. And I think you're also intentional in the platforms and mechanisms for communication. So the fact that there is a explicit social media dimension to the data streams here, I think is crucial. That we take into account where are people and we meet them where they're at. And I think that's a positive of this UN75 initiative to not necessarily do it for the first time on behalf of the UN, but to make that an explicit, conscious decision. So I would just say, meet people where they're at. That is a rule for researchers as much as it is for people who may call themselves advocates. You need to meet people where they're at.
Thanks for that piece of advice. Fabrizio, what's your take on that? How to bring in more women and how to bring in more youth into multilateral diplomacy?
Well, I think there are concrete structural changes that can be brought about, and there are ideas being floated around that I think the Secretary General would consider. One is, for example, to have a youth advisory council that would have parallel debates to the General Assembly and feed into those debates. So I think we can look at very concrete measures, and I think the Secretary General would do that to integrate a greater diversity of voices into member states' discussions, which are now the purview of, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but tend to be the purview of a group of aging diplomats. I mean, like myself, I'm not a diplomat, but I'm aging. I think there will be suggestions like that. But I do think listening is a very big thing, and I think it's an underestimated value, and I do think all of us have to get better at that. I started my career as a field officer for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and I spent a very large part of my time in refugee camps, listening to refugees, listening to their demands. And I have to say, 90% of the time, we couldn't respond to them. 90% of the time, within the limits of our resources, they were not realistic. But the very fact I found that people felt they were being heard, felt that UNHCR was reaching out and listening and explaining the constraints, went a very long way. And then, of course, within the limits of our resources, we did try to adjust our programs on what's done. So often, even when we set off on this program, people said, but you're just going to raise expectations. You shouldn't do it. Well, frankly, I don't agree with that, because I think listening and showing humility to the voices of others, engaging with others, has a value in itself, even when you can't deliver immediately on all the demands. It's a question of making people feel less excluded, more respected in their dignity, and more heard. And I think the Secretary General is very strong on this, that if there's a greater distance between institutions and people today, and a lot of distrust of international institutions and national institutions, a lot of it is this lack, this listening deficit. And I think also, as the father of 3 teenage children, that among youth, there is a particular sense of being disregarded and discounted, which leads to huge disenchantment, which then manifests itself in what we see on the streets in many countries in the world.
I really like your point about listening and the need to listen to people. And when one listens to people, as also stood out from the surveys, is that climate change is one of the key issues and one of the key challenges that people see. And that brings me to another question from the audience, which is a little longer, but very interesting. So let me read it out to you. It was interesting to see from the data in the report that respondents seem to be most concerned about the future impacts of climate change rather than health or security issues. Now comes the question, how could the UN push even more for a climate resilient, sustainable recovery, inspiring member states to adjust their investments and recovery packages accordingly? I think that's a question for you, Fabrizio.
Well, the Secretary General is advocating in exactly that direction. And I think we also have to recognize increasingly, I mean, we broke up our surveys under, are you concerned with pandemics, are you concerned with climate, etc. But in the real world, these things interact. I mean, I think it's 60% of new diseases are zootic. They have their origins in animal species, and they come to transfer to humans because of the damage we're doing to the environment. So global health pandemics are interlinked with damage to the environment. And of course, we know, I worked in the Sahel, we know that the impact of climate change has a direct impact on pastoral habits of people, which puts them into clashes with sedentary farmers. So it has a direct impact in terms of fueling conflict. So I'm afraid these issues all interact, in a very dangerous cocktail. What more can we do? I mean, the Secretary General, in advocating, the COVID is awful, but it's also a tremendous opportunity. Never before, since the Second World War, have governments had so much policy space, so much fiscal space to do things differently. There are investments going back into the public sector that were unheard of, that were uncontemplated, that would have been considered scandalous by governments just a year or two ago. And there's the opportunity then to think, well, do we really just do more of the same or do it differently? And the Secretary General has been very emphatic and very concrete in his recommendations, including at a speech today at the Paris Forum, of exactly what needs to be done to rebuild economies in ways that they're more inclusive and more climate sensitive. I mean, one big thing is that, tax subsidies should go towards helping those who are most needed and not towards boosting fossil fuel consumption. So there's a lot that can be done. And the question is whether governments will have the courage to take those steps. Many are, but many don't seem to be there yet.
And could I add something to that, Nora?
Sure, please go ahead, Jed.
So I feel like that I've presented the fact that climate change is seen as a challenge. Let me build just a little bit with past data that we've had from Pew Research Center. We collected globally through a larger set of countries, including the Global South. To what Fabrizio said, I would add that several years ago, when we focused on the question of climate change, there was a widespread recognition among citizens that this is not a normal challenge, that there will need to be concerted action, and there was support for governments taking action. I would point out that when it comes to the trade-offs, and people anticipate they'll have to make personal trade-offs, that's when you get into more challenging elements of what we'll actually be willing to do. But the mindset and the recognition of this is different and requiring action, concerted international action was there several years ago, and the problem has not faded in significance. So there's some context for what Fabrizio was saying.
Absolutely. Thanks for adding that, Jeb. And since we have three more minutes left, let's go to some more questions from our viewers. And here's a nice one for you, Jeb. Someone is asking whether there were any outcomes from the survey that really surprised you.
I think for me, as I've said already, one of the most surprising was that I was anticipating that COVID-19, the pandemic, would overshadow everything, and it didn't. And what that tells me is whether it's climate change, as we see in the 14 countries we surveyed, or more immediate questions of health and economic well-being, is that people understand the world's complex. And they're not focused on just one thing. And I think Fabrizio is right to say that we create questions that isolate these issues, but they're not necessarily seen in isolation. So we should acknowledge that. But just the fact that it wasn't only about COVID-19. And I would note that especially in the Global South, there was actually, and maybe this is a bit surprising, but good to hear, optimism about addressing the health challenges, about addressing educational improvements. Where there is pessimism, I must admit, is really around something that seems overwhelming, like climate change. But, let us be empathetic to ourselves. It's a huge challenge.
Wow, what a wonderful way to end on. Semi-optimistic, semi-realistic, I would say. Well, time has been flying, so we're almost at the end of this session. I thought it was extremely interesting to listen to both of you. I am happy that we can continue this conversation, be it at the UN in New York or in Berlin or in Washington, D.C. for that matter. I wanted to thank both of you very cordially, Fabrizio and Jeb, for doing this together. This was fantastic. Let me also say a warm thank you to our audience, to our viewers. Thank you very much for actively listening and for posing great question. This marks the end of day 2 of the Paris Peace Forum. We hope to welcome all of you again tomorrow. And with this, let me wish you all a wonderful rest of the day and see you soon once again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Stay safe.
Stay safe. Yes. Bye.
Bye.